and share a spoon and all look after each other, and that way we borrow things from our predecessors and we leave them for our next generation. I think an important part of motivation behind the speaker series. So let me just briefly introduce the concept of the speaker series. It arose from a challenge that was given to us by Frank Stronach, the founder of Magna, who said, I think universities are the hub of activity, of thought leadership, of solving the problems of the future. He made some derogatory comment about politicians, so I'll just make it about all politicians, to say that, you know, he thinks that we have a lot of bright minds and people committed to change, and he really wanted to stimulate that conversation. So he launched a Sarat Scholarship. You can find out details online in the chat, with a prize of $100,000 for the winner and 50 and 25 for the runners-up, asking the question, if you were Prime Minister of Canada, what would you do to look after the environment and the economy? And we invited a series of 7 guests, I'm going to say experts in various aspects of those issues, which are very complex issues, to come and share their insights, thoughts, what they're doing at the moment, to inform you if you want to enter that competition, or if you're just joining us for interest, you are very welcome. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Charles Hopkins, who's the UNESCO chair at York University. And he is an advisor to many organizations, including the UN, on various matters to do with education particularly. And so he'll be talking for maybe 25, 30 minutes. If you have a question during his conversation, please put it in the chat. At the end of the presentation, we will be asking questions. If you're looking for some clarification during his presentation, please put it in the chat. And if we think it's important, we'll interrupt, but otherwise we'll leave the questions until the end. So Charles, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, you're most welcome. And thank you not only for the introduction, but thank you, Ali, as well, for inviting me to come and to share some ideas and so on in this dialogue. But I've put in some slides just to support my thoughts, and so let me post those. And you know, I've been involved in this concept roughly, I guess, since the 1960s. And so I have some ideas and some concepts that I would like to share with the students, who are certainly those who are going to enter into the contest, but for others who are there as well. I guess let me begin by a problem I have with the question. If you were Prime Minister of Canada, what clear-cut policies and principles would you establish to improve the economy while also enhancing the environment? This is the concept that we had 35 years ago as we were going into Rio. It was built even prior to that with Stockholm, where in 1972, we finally tried to come to grips with environmental issues and environmental pollution. It was the first conference 50 years ago, this year. It will be 50 years since the first big conference trying to look at environmental issues on an international basis. Up to that point, we always thought of pollution as being local, a local river, a lake, air quality, and so on. And in 1972, we tried to look at international pollution, and we looked at it largely in isolation. A Canadian actually chaired the whole thing. And out of that 1972 meeting in Stockholm, they recommended that countries actually develop ministries of environment. Environmental Protection Agency was formed, and so on. And the idea of education, public awareness, and training programs for the general public was important. And I'm going to talk a lot in my talk about the need for public awareness, public understanding, and in particular, the role of education and focus on higher education and so on. So what Morris Strong felt as the chair was that the purpose of the economic life is to meet the social needs of people. And this is the missing piece. At Rio in 1992, we found that they decided you can't deal with environment in isolation. You know, in the 1970s, 60s, and 70s, that was Europe decolonizing, right? And so we had a myriad of countries that were living in poverty, but seeing the well-developed North and West. And they wanted development. They wanted to address that abject poverty. They wanted to have a much better life and so on. And they wanted development. Whereas those of us in the North who already were seeing the impact of pollution and so on, they wanted environmental protection. And so coming out of 1972, going into that huge clash between 20% of the population who wanted environmental protection and 80% who wanted development, the United Nations appointed Gro Harlem Brundtland, the Premier of Norway, to lead this international review of how do we reconcile this. And so was born the concept of sustainable development. It was approved in 1987, and countries were given 5 years to come up with an implementation plan. And so in 1992, in Rio de Janeiro, the UN conference moved beyond environment, and it was the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. So that is the question 35 years ago that we're looking at with this dialogue. That 1992 conference was hijacked. It was hijacked by society, who said you cannot leave it up to business and industry and environmentalists to sort out our lives. I was present there in 1992 in Rio, and the real action was on the streets. We had at times 70,000 people that were marching, that were there, listening to the Dalai Lama, listening to indigenous people, listening to the general public. And when the Rio conference was finished, we came up beyond that with the concept of adding social issues and society to it. So Morris Strong, again, was asked to be the chair of that first conference in Rio. But we realized that you couldn't do it just between countries, although it was heads of state that were invited to try and solve it. He knew you can't do anything without the private sector. And so he came up with the concept of eco-efficiency. That would be where business and industry could save money by reducing waste streams, by reducing energy costs and so on. So you go into eco-efficiency, and that was sort of the idea. But it was a starting point. It was to get business to the table. It wasn't to get the society, certainly, to the table. Now, let me give you some idea of why these issues are so complex that you can't just bring together environmental concerns and private sector concerns. This is Lake Chad, one of Africa's big lakes. Africa, the whole continent, only has a handful of really big lakes. And you can see on the left, there are 4 countries, right? There's Chad, Chad, and it's important to understand, Chad is Arabic in culture. It's Arabic and it is Muslim. The language is Arabic, but the culture is Islamic. And then you have Cameroon, also bordering on Lake Chad. Now, it is African in makeup, and it is Christian largely. And they are farmers, not the herders that you have in Chad, nomadic herders. And then Nigeria, which also shares the lake, African again, but Islamic, largely in that region. That's Boko Haram. And then Niger, also Islamic, African. Now, you can see in 1972, that huge lake, but by 2018, there is the lake. So the nomadic people have moved their herds largely into the farming regions, and tremendous clash. All those people who are out of water, they are also out of an economy. So the environment and the economy, and then you have the cultural clash of religions. And one of the results is this. You have the large-scale migration of people into Europe. And so there you have sort of the idea of one being totally influencing, enforcing on the other. Now, the World Economic Forum each year looks at risks. And in this report for 2020, it was prepared in 2019, just before COVID, you can see two things. One, the closer to the center, the more important the issue was predicted to be. Okay? And so right in the center, you have climate action failure, okay? Because we just are not moving that far. You can also see different colors in the issues. And towards the outside, you can see infectious diseases. The thing I would like you to look at, though, is the interrelationship between all of these different things. It is a spider web. You can't just address one thing in isolation for the other. So for those of you who are going into the competition, I want you to sort of keep in mind the idea of the complexity and the need for public understanding of these issues. You need an informed public, whether they are simply who they vote for, but really how they live their life, the purchases that they're going to make. Now, the next year, the World Economic Forum came out, and they had once again, but this time they arranged it not in the center, but how high up on the axis. The idea of impact being on the vertical axis and the likelihood of it happening on the horizontal. And you can see way up in that top right-hand corner, most likely to happen and of impact, climate action, infectious diseases. COVID had actually hit, but you can see the other ones. This chart doesn't quite show the interrelationships that you want. So really the global challenge that we have is how can we collaboratively create an economic system, okay, that ensures both current humanity's ability to thrive equitably, because if it's unequal, that's when you'll have wars. That's when you will have violence and disruption of peace and so on, and the ability of the Earth's resilience and capacity to support future generations. Right? So that is sort of the huge global challenge that we have, and the current answer that we have is sustainable development. Now, sustainable development, the best we could come up. Remember I said there was this clash between those who wanted environmental protection and those who wanted development. So in 1987, they came up, well, let's do both, right? So it's development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs as well. I like an African definition. I'll just throw it out for you. An African indigenous elder's definition is enough for all forever. Enough for all forever. And being an indigenous person for all was not limited to his tribe. It wasn't limited to all Africans. It wasn't limited to humans. It was for all life. And then the intergenerational, which I think is another word. Now, it's been a long march, as I said, from the founding of the United Nations to be able to look at issues that go beyond borders, okay? And so the Brundtland Report in 1987, but then they had to come up with an implementation plan. What do we actually do? You can't just pronounce something, we have to try and do it. And for 5 years, countries negotiated, and so what they could do, what were the issues, what were they willing to take part? And one of the core parts of that was a chapter in Agenda 21, which was the implementation plan ratified in Rio, was on education, public awareness, and training. Now that ran until 2000, and we tried to spruce it up again, and then we brought in the Millennium Development Goals with 8 goals, and again, education was there. And then we realized that went from 2000 to 2014, and as we got close to the end, we decided, look, you can't solve the world's issues around development in a sustainable manner with just 8 targets, 8 goals. And so the UN opened up and consulted millions, literally millions of people around the world using the internet. In countries like Finland, their Ministry of the Environment hosted the Finland We Want. And people were consulted all over. And out of that, from the world we want, arose the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which are just the current implementation plan. In around 2027, 2028, we're going to start to negotiate yet another implementation plan, and hopefully we'll have a better concept or a modified concept of sustainable development that will address the problems and issues in the current one. The current concept of sustainable development, again, is small, it's narrow. It doesn't address worldview. It doesn't address ethics, largely. There are so many things that are just not out there. It doesn't address faith-based groups and so on. But one of the huge changes in that was the idea of as well as the issues of poverty and gender equality and so on, was the solution in the end, the idea of partnerships. No longer would this be left up just to countries to negotiate and come up with their implementation plan. And key in that is that the United Nations called on education, and in particular, higher education. You know, globally, only about 7% of the world's population gets to go to higher education. But that 7% will be 80% of the people who will shape the future of the world. So higher education is a particularly key point. And I love the idea that you're having this dialogue, and I congratulate Frank Stronach on bringing this issue forward. The United Nations particularly called for research in these issues with goals 2, 3, 4, 13, 14, and so on, as to be partners. And this fits in so nicely. If you look at the one on the right, the concept, the values, the academic values that are inherent in higher education align beautifully with the Sustainable Development Goals in the bottom. And the idea of universities providing knowledge, providing research, educating those influencers and so on in the future, and to be partners in policy formation. But at the same time, higher education, if it rises to the challenge, higher education can become significant They can play a huge role, and the public will be so appreciative and aware of the contributions of higher education. Now, it is so important that within the Sustainable Development Goal 4, the idea of education for sustainable development is actually identified, along with the concept of global citizenship, where people feel that they are part of, they are responsible. Not only do I have rights as a citizen, but I have responsibility. And the need to create a feeling of common engagement as well in global citizenship, also giving people the ability to mobilize, to become engaged, to become part of the reformation of development towards a more sustainable way. But the United Nations General Assembly on three occasions have come forward and recognizing that education for sustainable development, not just any education, but education that addresses sustainable development, is crucial, as is a critical enabler of all of the other sustainable development goals. So the idea that it's not a topic in per se, it is a purpose of education. It's a holistic approach. And what we're doing at York of embedding it in science, but also in philosophy, in the arts, we're trying to address it in this holistic way, embed it into what we're learning so that it becomes just a way of seeing things. And ultimately, the whole question of a sustainable future should be addressed within our worldviews. So that's a very important part. And to do this, what the UNESCO is doing, UNESCO advises ministries of education all around the world. It's sort of the collective. It brings people from all countries together to work on problems and issues in a collective way. And now they have just gone through, again, consultations with well over 1 million people on the futures of education. And they're coming back and seeing that education should be a social contract between the providers and people, but also a social contract of knowledgeable people in a contract with other people. Right? Look at what is happening in Ukraine right now, and here we are on very likely the verge of another global war, and we're into it by looking at it in self-reflective, how, about the well-being of me, as opposed to that social aspect. Now, what they are asking for is transforming education itself in a way. Yes, the first step is the acquisition of knowledge and information, and then going on to critically analyze, what is it that I'm learning? Is this right? Is it wrong? To actually experience it. And again, at York, with the new thrust on experiential education, so critical. But a big missing component is the one around compassion and actual engagement. How do I care for someone other than just myself? Because we all know that information alone is not enough. We all know about not smoking. We all know about, all these different things, diet and so on. But it's how does one actually become involved? So those are important things. The other one, I'll quickly move along, is how do we take these 17 goals and then build this compassion, this experience? How can we transform our education systems and so on, so that we actually take action and become involved? And we have to bring them into meaningfulness. We have to bring these 17 goals down and translate them into our local setting. And I challenge that we must take them and bring them into our personal lives. That's even a step further. So the concept of corporate social responsibility should be seen as institutional responsibility for all of York itself, but also personal responsibility of the individual. And the only way we can do that is by thinking about it and seeing exemplars and so on of the whole thing. So the idea of how do we engage all sectors of society in this? And so part of it, again, is I'm putting forward the idea of not only education, but public awareness, public understanding, and so on. And then making it involved in our value system so that people who are doing it are admired and moving it, and addressing that whole ethical aspects of it, and to convince people that it is doable. You know, we can, and that we will save money. You know, the eco-efficiency part, we're not throwing that out. No, that's an important part, but the eco-efficiency isn't just limited to the corporate. It is part of all. So the idea then can be, by wrapping up with the idea of global citizenship, it's a sense of belonging. It's a sense of being part of humanity. And so the importance of international education, right, of learning with others, to being a part of something meaningful and big by local action. We are involved in meaningfulness on a much grander scale, and so on. The idea of interdependency of humans, those webs that I showed you on the World Economic Forum, those strings and webs, that's about people itself, right? So it's not that we give up our Canadian citizenship and nothing of that nature. It's a state of mind. It is a way of feeling that you are linked to others. It's important also that people, as you assume responsibility and you become a global citizen, there are some things you need to know and to understand. One of them is understanding the three main stages, whether it's climate change or addressing social values around forced migration. All of these things, there are the three steps. There's what do we do to prevent it from happening in the first place? Secondly, how do we reduce the impact? And thirdly, how do we adapt to the inevitable? When it does happen, how do we do the best we possibly can? So that's just sort of one of the aspects that we have. The emerging technology, the different worldviews, these are important aspects that we're going to have. In particular, those of you who are in engineering or whatever you're in, as we look into technology that is coming forward with Industry 4.0, that all computers, whether it's your refrigerator or a computer, will be linked to everything else, that we understand that kind of a society. And it's beyond prevention, but it can be into mitigation, and we can be certainly into adaptation. Right? But along with that, we have to prepare society 5.0. And this is the work that is going on largely in Asia now. Currently, with 4.0, we can use the internet and so on, and we can go out and we can surf and look and get whatever information we want. In 5.0, with big data, they look at what we've been looking at and then modify, and that is the information that is given to us and fed to us. We already see that from the television stations we watch down to the information that we see on our computer, who determines what is news, what are we going to be reading, all of that will be shaped back down to us. So what does this evolution in capability and technology, what does this mean about a sustainable future? In clear thinking, how do I make up my mind? all of that. These are issues that we need to really worry about. Lastly, the idea of engagement. It is so crucial because much of this is overwhelming. And how do we react to that without going into a shell and so on? It is so important that each one of us have an ecological footprint. I mean, the whole notion of the ecological footprint is now centered at York University, and it's moved there from UBC and California. But let me leave you with the idea of the ecological handprint that came from a little girl in grade 4 in India, where she said, yes, I have a footprint, but I have hands. I can do something about my footprints. And just how you take that, personalize it, bring it inside you, so that what we do as individuals matters. Again, Morris Strong saying, what we do as individual matters. It all adds up. So I hope that I have put forward a few, maybe even provocative ideas for your consideration, whether you are taking part, as I say, in the contest, or whether you just tuned in. And I thank you very, very much for those of you who have joined me. Well, I'll leave it at that point.
So first of all, thank you very much. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions and then see if Ali has a couple of questions to ask. And then we'll go over and see if anyone that's on the call would like to ask a question. I guess so first of all, I think the history is very interesting and how this has evolved. And I think that, it raises in our minds the importance. But I'm kind of getting to the question is, at the level of the country, like if someone said to you, okay, you're presenting to the cabinet tomorrow and they can implement some of the things that you are, you're talking about regarding education, how we change it in a practical way. In other words, what could we do next month in Canada or next year in Canada, I mean, longer time frame maybe, to actually change it? Because, my frustration is that there's some visionaries who see this, but it's not actually happening in practice. We still have to deal with day-to-day stuff. Mm-hmm. So what would you prioritize as, 2 or 3, if you like, calls to action that you would think would be important, that would be part of the change in how we increase the role of education in society and link it more to sustainability, etc.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really feel that getting the public on board is important. Politicians, the government, the policymakers, and so on, their main goal is not good governance. Okay? Their goal is staying in power. Okay, so if they really want to do the right thing, then they need to educate the general public. You can do it in several ways. One is you can do the campaigns and and so on. In many countries I go around, even you get on the bus in Bonn, Germany, there are little hangers up there with advertising the Sustainable Development Goals and what the city of Bonn is doing about it on the back. They're trying to bring all of that forward. So you can do the public awareness kinds of campaigns. But our school systems, it's being left to to teachers to carry this on their backs. It's not, and within schools, you have individual teachers who are stepping forward. My program works in 50 countries on reorienting teacher education faculties to address sustainability. Trying to get that up and running, because everyone is into their own particular area, not realizing that their particular area contributes greatly to sustainability. And then lastly, getting the universities on board. The universities themselves are climbing on board, but it's largely through ranking programs. It's not to try and per se and help governments or help society. So yeah, there are other things that we can do, but the first step is to get people to accept it and not see it in the old way. Well, if we do that, it's going to increase costs, we won't be competitive, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it does seem to be painted as a choice of sustainability or the economy. And I think that's why, first of all, I think it's why Frank set the challenge. But I also think that you just made a really important point, which is whether we like it or not, whether we like some politicians or not, most of their job is about getting into power and staying in power. And most of the actions they take relate to that. And very few of them are motivated by some of these big challenges. And maybe it's almost too much to expect that they will be. I know there are a few people that can get beyond the politics. I remember having a great conversation with Lord Sainsbury, who was in the House of Lords in England, who had the innovation file for the government. And he said, I love this because I get paid £1 a year because I don't take my salary. And because he had enough money because of Sainsbury's, the company that his family had started. And I don't have elections, so I don't have to be, I just can do good things for innovation strategy. And he did, and he built that in. And so it strikes me that, elected officials are not going to solve any of these problems really in a meaningful way, which I think points somewhat to universities. I think industries can play a role, but they obviously have a role to their shareholders and stakeholders and others. So I think universities, maybe now is the time, and I know this is a more direct challenge than the big question I asked you, for universities like York, and I know you do a lot yourself, to actually say this is important, and this is how we educate people to make it important to engage, etc.
Yeah, well, the surveys coming out from Time Higher Education is now showing that students themselves are very concerned about the reputation of their university on how it's addressing sustainability in the future. And being critical of sustainability is an important role of higher education. We can't just, swallow it as it is. It's the best we have at the moment. But as I was pointing out, it has many faults, sustaining what, and for whom. There are very real fundamental questions, but we need to improve upon them. And hopefully as we start looking further into the future, we can do it. But governments won't do it, and the private sector can't do it without public support. They need knowledgeable citizens, knowledgeable political support, and they need knowledgeable consumers. Right? Otherwise, it just doesn't work.
So I have a bunch of other questions, but I'm not going to be greedy. I have some great questions from Mubarak. I'm going to come to them in a second. Okay. Before I do, Ali, do you have a question that you would like to ask Charles?
Well, thank you very much. I was actually going to ask Mubarak to start with his question. Go ahead, Mubarak.
Hello, Professor, and all. How are you? I'm Mubarak Ali from India.
Oh, hello.
Thanks for your invaluable. Namaste, sir. Namaste. I'm Mubarak Ali from India.
Yes.
Thanks for your invaluable insights, sir. Extending my sincere thanks to organizers for this opportunity. The topic is what a lovely topic. You, me, and sustainability. We are working for the future. I think the future depends upon to all in our hands, sir. My question is, should everyone be sustainability confident?
Well, I think yes, they should be knowledgeable about it, and but I also think that there is a responsibility to act. There's a difference between being knowledgeable and actually acting. We can have some people who are very, very knowledgeable yet do the wrong thing, you know. So, and then there are so many people in the world that are knowledgeable, but because of poverty or their situation, there's not much that they can do. So the action should be almost, it should be linked to your capability. You know, these are thoughts that I think that could come out of the Schulich or something, you know, along the line of taxation. You pay according to your income. That sustainability and your reaction, it should be linked somehow to your capability. But thank you. That's a neat question. The thing is, how do we get everyone literate in that way and understanding is because it goes beyond training, doesn't it? Mm-hmm.
It doesn't. I think part of it is.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for the views. Sorry for the interruption, sir. My second question: how to keep sustainability at the forefront of decision making?
Yeah, I think it should be right up there with gender, racism, legal, you know, different ways in which people think, and certainly in the way in which corporations think. You know, it's just embedded in decision making. I'll leave it at that. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, and thanks for the opportunity. Thank you.
You're most welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Jesse, you have a question?
Thank you so much for the historical overview. That's amazing. One of the challenges to actually learning about SDGs is actually this tremendous information, and your talk was really great for that challenges. And excuse me if my question could be somehow provocative. Just want to, I'm still like, I don't know how to phrase my question. I think that's one of the challenges as well. So, for example, in mathematics, you know, mathematics is well known for old unsolved problems. For example, like 300 unsolved problems, and these problems could be solved after building tremendous structures, like defining the terms. And so it took 300, even if the question itself was brought up 300 years old, the possibility of solving the solution, the problem, could be done after building these huge educational materials. And I wonder how the educators are doing. I wonder if we are asking students, the future generation, to solve the problems which are not well phrased yet. So like, for example, do you have any idea about the quality education? Are we helping students to understand what we mean by the equity in education? What is the possible definitions? Do we give them some skills to measure the current equities? So just from mathematics, that's actually coming from students' point of view. I believe there are people who are building those structures, definition of equities in education. Mm-hmm. But are we trying hard to give these resources, basic resources, to the students or the future generation, starting from kindergarten, that they can actually answer, or they are confident to actually think about those? Because even myself, when I see the questions, there's still insecurity Do I understand the question? Is my so I think building such foundational resources, like defining the equity, categorizing what we mean by equity, difference between equity and equality, local, micro, macro. Building such structures would be extremely essential to actually come up with solution. I think SDGs problems are extremely challenging, grand challenges, because we don't want to leave anyone behind on the globe. But that's in math, the quantifier is for all, and that leaves, and people are working so hard for several decades. But like the current generation, we need to be educated to come up with the new ideas. And so my question is, what do you think how we are doing as educators locally at York University, globally in Canada? And yeah, so what do you think? Where are we as an educator? Like, should we be a little bit embarrassed? Should we feel urgent to construct such materials to I don't know, give the students something that they can use? For example, you showed us this huge network, spiders, but the reality is to solve the problem, we need to understand the complexity though. We cannot ignore it, but most of the materials we can find on the web, on the internet, actually they do not talk about this complexity. But
yeah.
Yes, yes,
So,
that's
Jesse,
my question.
So I'm going to let Charles answer first, and then I'm going to give you an answer as well, because it's a really good question.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is the ideal, and then there is the reality of where we are right now. If we look at the amount of budgets and so on that are going in around the world. So from an equity perspective, yeah, the world is very, very unequal. Okay? But there's another component, and that is, it is an ongoing debate about what is quality education. There are the measurements around math, language, science, and so on, put out by OECD as to how do different institutions, how different school systems and so on compare. So a school system can be very, very high in this PISA score, the program for the program instrument for, I can't even think of it, PISA, I'll think of it. Performance indicators for, yeah, sorry. At any rate, that's one thing, but what is the purpose of education? Okay, so when we were doing our work with Indigenous people, their standards of quality are what they want their youth to have, and so on, are very, very different. So we have to take into concern about what the local idea of what is a quality education and what should people need, what should they know, and so on. So Andrew, I'll let you take over from there, but I don't want to get into how well we're doing, York.
So it's a really interesting challenge, and I think that you phrased some things in your question that were fundamental in the approach that I've adopted to education, and certainly I use at York, and that is the difference between problem solving and creative problem solving. And so I'm going to say I characterize problem solving as what you do at high school, where you're given a problem. There is usually one way to get to a solution. You have to get that way, and then there's a right solution. Creative problem solving, you have to find the problem, and the first part is identifying the problem and getting to the root cause of the problem. And so the reality is that we have such a tendency as individuals to solve problems that we often don't solve the right problem, or we focus on the wrong aspect, or we don't define the problem in a way that you can measure that you've reached a solution. And so I think that, just going back to what Charles said, the issue around equity in education is different in every location, every country, even in the great GTA, it's different. And I'm a great believer in, acting local and thinking global. So I think the question is, and by the way, we run hackathons on this at York every year called Unhack. A great question that would come out from that would be, how might we improve equity of access to education for high school students or for university students or whatever. And then that would mean you would actually define what you mean by that, and then you would put it in the context, and that would be part way to coming up with solutions. So I think the other comment I would make is, when we're defining these problems, we always talk a lot about right sizing them. In other words, framing the problem in a way that you can be involved in the solution and not passing the solution to somebody else. So we've had people come in with a big problem, and the only answer they came up with, oh, government should fix it. Well, that's fine, but that's not problem solving, it's passing the problem. And I'm not saying that some things shouldn't be fixed by government, but I think it's really good to ask people what we can do. And so part of the conversation that we're having around this area is, I mean, yes, it is York centric because it started at York, but we want to engage universities across the country, is what can we as universities, as faculty, as students, do from our universities to actually move the dial on this, not solve it, but move the dial to address some of these important issues. And how do we prioritize them, and how do we do solutions? And so I'm going to come to Alfred. Alfred had a really great question about the role of competitions on sustainability, which I do want to ask specifically. But if we start to solve them, how do we share them and celebrate them in a way that adds to the dialogue and builds momentum and creates confidence? So I know that's my answer. Before I go to Alfred's question, do you want to add anything, Ali?
No, actually, it's good to go to Alfred. I will ask another question after that.
Okay, so Alfred had this question, and Alfred, feel free to kind of raise your hand if you want to come on the screen and ask it, but how can we use competitions on sustainability to help promote awareness in people to take real actions? He asked the question because he sees in Ghana that their competitions produce winners, and the winners are showcased to show their brilliance and dexterity and ability to have impact. So have you got any thoughts on that? Which would be very interesting for me, Charles, as well, because we do these events and we have winners, but we don't do much with them afterwards.
Yeah, I think it depends on the culture as to how you respond to the idea of competition. Some systems really frown on it, say competition has no place in sustainability. I'm not out there. I think that competitions are helpful. They kind of model real life. Corporations are in competitions. Government political parties are in competition, and learning how to frame a competition in a way that is not harmful, and then how do you celebrate the winners? It's all part of a much bigger societal issue, but. The one thing that I do like is the idea of setting standards or rubrics, and everyone who meets that standard gets that kind of recognition, as opposed to there can only be one, and then you keep moving the standard. I mean, that's how sustainable products, that's how the government of Canada tried to run their eco rankings of products. So this year, this paint company would have the most ecologically appropriate paint, but the competition would come out next year and they would try to improve upon that. And then the winner of that year would get the eco logo, and it's progressive, because oftentimes you can't even envision what the standard should be. And once everyone gets to the standard, how do you move the standard? It's complexity, but I'm not against competition at all.
You know, it's interesting. So Andre made a comment, we need to work towards something that's more unifying and less divisive. And this issue of competition is really interesting for me. So
Yeah.
I run a program with the University of Calgary in Alberta on the energy transition. And how do we encourage, stimulate, help people involved in the energy field in Alberta become more environmentally responsible, because there are a lot of them who feel very strongly that what they're doing needs to be changed, etc. And so we basically organize a program starts with 250 middle level, mainly engineers in Alberta. And then we go through this pitching process and filtering process. But the cool thing is, at the end of the day, we ended up with 8 projects, teams of 4 or 5 people in each. And we took them to a meeting, and there was no winner. There was only kind of pass fail. And the pass fail was, yes, you should get some seed investment, or no, you shouldn't. And 5 out of the 8 passed. And so they're now a cohort working together based out of the Energy Transition Center in Calgary. All have some seed funding, and all are going to get the next round of funding, providing they hit some milestones. So I think that it's really beneficial to change the culture around these issues to one of cooperation and collaboration and impact together than straight competition. But it doesn't remove the need to have some standards and some benchmarks to say, yeah, you're in or out. So I think it's really interesting.
It brings about Jesse's issue of equity. You know, Harvard has they put $25 million from their endowment fund into a sustainability fund to play with. Well, what they can do, if it was a competition, what they could do, according to what York could do, or Trent, what they could do, you know, so the thing around equity is another issue. It's not simple.
So let me ask a question from Neil, and then, sorry, Alice, did you want to ask a question?
No, go ahead. I will after you. No worries.
So Neil had a really interesting question, and actually something that's upset me a lot at the moment, and I'm not sure I have any answers to it. But he says there are always going to be polarities, whether it's vaccine hesitancy, climate change, environmental pollution, sustainable growth. You know, how do you handle it? Which government programs or country do you think has handled the backlash when it comes to policy changes regarding environmental or sustainability issues?
I guess the Scandinavian countries have are probably leading the way, but it is all part of their, it's a very highly educated and open society and so on. Again, the reason why I'm in my talk, I'm promoting knowledge and public understanding of the issue. You know, we have the people who just want the governor general to take over and run the country with some appointed people, and they have the suggestions as to who should be appointed. You know, underlying it all, if we're going to really grow and develop, is that idea of information, being an informed, thoughtful society that is built upon values and principles, like the principles of the Earth Charter. You know, if you're going to start on a base and then build a knowledgeable one beyond that, the Earth Charter, which was created by ordinary people from all around the world over a number of years, is a beautiful document. I quite often use that if I'm talking and people say, for instance, in India, very early on, people say it's a question of values. And yeah, but in another country, just sort of south of us, if we bring up the idea of values, immediately people get their back up and say, whose values? You're not putting your values on my kids, you know, and you don't want to touch the whole idea of exploring values and principles and so on.
Charles, thank you. Just a quick comment on that. I'm going to go to Ali for a question. So first of all, there's a great new book, well, new last year by Mark Carney called Values. And I tried to get Mark to come and do one of these speaker series. It's just difficult to get hold of him. He hasn't said no, but it's just difficult. But he actually talks about this a lot, where they come from and how they're formed. And I think it is really important. I think, you know, I mentioned when I asked that question something that really upset me. The thing that really upset me is, and I'm not going to point out a particular issue, but maybe it's around the vaccine or something, because I feel very strongly about that. That most of the people that are against vaccine are based on misinformation. That they've got some information wrong, or they're not comparing, you know, one statistic with another. They've heard something. And there was a professor, and I was just trying to look up his name while we were talking, but in BC last week, who said, one of our jobs as academics is teach people how to think critically, so that when they hear a piece of information, they can actually go and check whether it's actually right or not. I keep hearing things, I try and do it in my class, that to me seem wrong, and I will go and check it. And, you know, one class I taught at York, one of the students said something in the class, and I go, I just can't believe that's true. It's, you know, very interesting. And so I said, I need to look at that, but you know, face validity strikes me as wrong. And afterwards he said, I said, can you send me a link to the website? And he did. And it was a satirical piece, and the author was Mr. Potato Head. And it was like, the guy was actually knew exactly what he was talking about, and he was making a very satirical view of something. But it gave some people that read it the view that it was, you know, the opposite. And so, you know, I do think that one of the things that we need to do is to teach people those critical thinking skills. In fact, we did a study for the Ontario government 2 years ago, identifying what companies thought were the most valuable skills we could teach students, and critical thinking and creative problem solving were the top two. So I think they're really important approaches that we need to embed, because, you know, we need to you know, we may not agree on things, but we need to come from a base where there's some alignment of values and where we accept certain data, although we always have to be cautious where it comes from. Ali, did you have a question?
Yeah, I actually want to build on what Charles mentioned about this differences from one hand, and also possibility of convergence from the other hand, between the global and local or national level priorities. And I want to provide you with, this is also relevant to what Jessie mentioned about in her question, mentioning about different levels of society reactions and actions to all these issues. I was on sabbatical leave during 2019, and I did a study, and this is my area of research, of course, this in disaster and emergency management. And I did a study to compare global risk as listed by the World Economic Forum, and did the same study on at national level. I was in Turkey, so I used the companies in Turkey to come up with their answers to the same questions asked by the World Economic Forum on you know, global angle. And I'm going to share with you the result that I came up with, and this gives you an example of complexity of the situation. So maybe I said. So this one is, of course, I mean, I'm referring to this because you also mentioned this in your presentation, which was quite interesting also. This is for 2019 for what is presented by the World Economic Forum. As you can see here in this study, of course, for example, extreme weather and failure in climate change mitigation, and then adaptation and natural disaster. All these green icons you see here are, of course, environmental related issues, disaster risks, etc. And some of these that you see here, particularly, let me go down a bit so that you can see the labels, are more on economic aspects and risk etc. So I did the same study just to see how these things would differ if we really get a sample from a national economy or national players. And these are small companies, we call it SMEs in Turkey. We had a relatively good sample among them. Now, if you look here, all these greenish green colors or symbols are the same risks that were, of course, ranked high in the global or in World Economic Forum or Global Risk Index. On the other hand, you see most of the economic related or economy related risk are ranked highest by the mid-size, small-size businesses in Turkey at that time frame. So these partially represent or says that, you know, what are the risks or the way risks are perceived at local and national level may be different from what is perceived at the global level, because the global level risks that are measured by World Economic Forum are mainly from companies that are working internationally. Now, my question, and at the same time, the question or results we came out through this, that there is always this, you know, difference between what is perceived at local level or national level versus what is perceived at the global level, and how to reconcile this, how to bring this together is a major issue. Because if these players here are really looking and thinking that for them the most important, for example, problem is severe, for example, energy price shock, for these people, these are really about 95 or 299% of businesses in a country and globally also at the same level. What their reactions are when we ask them, you know, about trade-off between these risks. And so this is like a comment and also sort of a question to all of us to think about. Really matters are really different at different scales. And so that's it. That's an example of how the differences are. And I just would like to know what's your reactions or points about these kind of differences at national, international, global levels. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan, for bringing that forward. I think if you were to look at different sectors of society and ask them what the risks were, like that was looking at Turkish SMEs, right? Heads of small to medium-sized enterprises at a local level. It doesn't matter whether it's Turkey or whatever country. Your point is local to global. Yeah, I think if you were to look at leaders of faith-based groups and say, what are the big issues, then maybe the societal ones would go up a little higher and so on. So it's important that we know who took the sample, what was actually reported in the sample, what was left out, it's the whole thing of thinking critically, but what is omitted as well as what is in error and so on. Yeah. I think what you've done with the SMEs is good because once again, it's global economic, World Economic Forum, and SMEs with small economic perceptions as and what would really affect their particular business. You know. Good insight. Thank you.
Thank you. Back to you, Andrew. Are there any questions from the audience?
Charles, I'm asking a general question. So we have struggled with this lecture series to get engagement across Canada. And I have to say, I'm wearing big Canadian hat and flag on this, because I'd like to see Canada play more of a global leadership role in this area, and I think it's positioned to do so. So I don't think that that's a big controversial issue. Have you got any ideas about how we might collaborate more with colleagues at other institutions across Canada? I'm thinking obviously of universities, but happy to include colleges and high schools to try and create more of this dialogue and understanding. I mean, I think one of the things that we know is that curiosity and discussion can sometimes help people see different perspectives, and then they find they're actually much closer than they realize, even if they still want to say different things. Have you got thoughts on how we actually, I'm going to say, might extend what Ali and I started with this program to try to make it have much bigger impact across the country, which was Frank Strong's original intention when he did the scholarship?
Yeah. Whatever one university does usually runs into the roadblock of competition, and so I think that if you were to do it again next year, if it was under a national student body or international even student body leadership, that it may have a bigger pickup. I know what really turned things around in Sweden, it was student power. The student unions are fairly strong in Sweden. And back in 1997, way back then, the government of Sweden wanted to engage universities in this kind of a dialogue. And the faculties put up the red flags that you can't tell university professors what to say or what to teach or what to research. We have academic freedom, and so the government went with the student bodies, and they said, we're not trying to tell you can criticize sustainable development all you want, but you must engage, even if it's an anti-sustainable development thing, and say it's watering down environmentalism and so on. And it was the students themselves that made the big swing. And the government gave the universities, each university got a couple of funded chairs in sustainability. It was, the gift to the university and to the professors, but it was student engagement. The Sustainable Development Student Network,
So first of all, I think that's given me lots of insights. I hope it's useful for other people. I think, part of the thing that we've done with our hackathons is they've been empowered by getting students involved, and students get really interested in this. I mean, the very first, but if you came to my first term class at Lausanne Engineering, I basically shared the 17 UN SDGs, and each student in the room has to tell me which one they're passionate about and what they would like to do to fix it, as it relates to them. In other words, they're not allowed to solve world hunger, but maybe how they could solve food waste in another country or whatever. And when I ran it the first time, which was my first class at York, I was shocked at the diversity of issues that the students wanted to address, because they were just different from my background, and it was just so powerful that engaging the students, because then it relates to things that they think are important too. So Andre, do you want to go on the screen and talk about your question about incentives and sharing ideas? Or do you want just me to ask it? If you raise your hand, I'll come to you. Otherwise, I'll just ask the question. Okay, so Andre raised a really good question, which is something actually I was talking about with somebody around innovation activities at York yesterday. It says, if someone comes up with a good idea, what happens to the idea? What incentives beside a grant does the person with the idea get? And just to add my comment to that, typically, and I'm a faculty, so I'm talking about from a faculty, in York, if you say you come up with a good idea, they say, well, yeah, you go away and do it, and all that means is you work harder, and you're not recognized or compensated for it. I suspect that for the students, they don't, that the incentives are outside so it's difficult to provide incentives that are not related to a degree, but that might be required to actually have people come up with sustainability ideas that they can implement. So I'm just wondering how we could, even at a York-centric level, how could we incent people, faculty, students, staff, to be more involved in implementing ideas and sharing?
I'm sorry, was that for me?
Well, I think it was a general question. If someone's got an idea, I see Catherine put her hand up. So do you want to talk about that? I mean, I think it's a general question because it comes out from our hackathons that we get so many great students, so many great ideas, and we can stay on top of a couple, but it's just difficult.
Yeah, I generally feel we seem to not to apply I catch myself often not to apply the knowledge that we actually already have. None of us who are receiving a salary being at York are doing our work for the salary. It is proven that motivational engagement and all of that doesn't come through $100 more, even $1,000 more. That motivation and that satisfaction holds on for maybe a month, maybe 3 months. We are doing this because we feel we have a purpose, we can contribute, and we can make a difference. I feel it is very, very similar for students out there. They're coming for the degree, yes, and they want to walk away with a good degree and it will mean something for their formal career, but that's just the formal stage. They're coming in with ideas if their ideas make a difference. If they see that their ideas can change something at York, that they can contribute to the university that they're at, that they can contribute in the community that they're at, and it matters what they say. And that's the way I feel about all of these events where we're really trying to engage with students, but I think we have to learn to open up more and co-create, design those events that we're holding with students to really fit their needs, fit their style of learning. We have often transferred what we think is a proper time setting and the way we're interacting into the virtual space now. But I think we need to be more open to learn and rather take a role as a co-coordinator, and I'm purposefully doubling, rather than the leaders in this, because I think there's so much more to learn from our students than we're actually admitting. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great comment. Thank you so much. So I noticed we're kind of running out of time. Anyone with last questions or comments? There's some nice comments in the chat about the discussion. I think one of the things that's emerged from your presentation, Charles, is all of us reimagining how education, and as educators we can play a bigger role in this. And so maybe this session today has stimulated us more to think about that and to do things. And again, I'm sure we'll be back to you on that, because I think, as was just said, you know, we're intrinsically motivated. We're not extrinsically motivated, although sometimes, you know, getting recognition is good, but we're intrinsically motivated. We chose these careers to make a difference. I think that, you know, the frustrations we maybe have, or I have, is I'm not making as big a difference as I feel I should be. And so I think that this is part of an ongoing dialogue of how we change, how we interact. And I think engaging the community, getting feedback and having these discussions is part of that. So any last comments from Ali?
Yeah, I fully agree. And thank you, Charles, for great insight in that. And yeah, education, of course, plays a major role in higher education in particular, and in both ways. One is that we are, of course, responsible for education of these issues. And on the other hand, we are a part of this economy as educational system, which both ways can contribute hugely into the success of what you know, moving towards sustainability. And thank you. And that's That's my conclusion. But if we have time, sometimes at the end, I would like also to share what is coming next
That's exactly. I was doing the same thing, so you beat me to it.
Yeah, go ahead then, if you have everything ready.
Well, actually, do you have the slide handy? I mean, I was going to talk about Eric Miller.
Yeah, I have it.
So next week we're going to feature Eric Miller, who's at York also in the Faculty of Environmental Studies. And the funny thing that happened with this is that when we were originally talking about the concept of asking students to think what they would do if the Prime Minister of Canada related to the Sarat Scholarship, Frank Stronach told me that he was actually involved in a CBC TV show called Canada's Next Prime Minister, and that they had they asked people the same question, and they had a bunch of political commentators interviewing them, and the final judging was actually done by 5 former prime ministers, which was really, really cool. And I think you know, it seems like I don't know why that didn't take off like Dragon's Den, you know, why it stopped, but maybe it's not as good on ratings. But anyway, the reason for saying that is Eric was actually one of the semi-finalists in that competition. So he was active about thinking about this at an early stage, and now he's at York in environmental studies, and he's going to be talking about the economy. He's going to talk about gross domestic product being gross and well-being is better. I think he's going to be talking about happiness, and that's on March the 2nd. So I hope we'll see you then.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you for joining us.
And Charles, thank you so much for your time and insights today. I think inspiring, great to know the history, and great to know the Canadian leadership. Originally, I knew Maurice Strong. I met him a couple of times. I had forgotten his important role in this agenda. So, you know, maybe it's not just going to be Canada's next Prime Minister, but maybe we can find someone in our community that can be the next global leader on sustainability.
Great. Thanks very much for involving me.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. We'll see you all next week.
See you. Bye-bye.